I thought I had until the end of this movie, but... well, it looks like I have until the end of the second movie. So I have a bit of time to type this up and hopefully get some advice, or at least get a warning out to some. I went to the cinema to see 1917 a couple of hours ago with my friend Phoebe. I'd already seen it shortly after it was first released, but she hadn't seen it yet and I thought it was a great movie, so I was happy to see it again with her. When we entered the room to take our seats, there was only one person there. A man sitting right at the back row, wearing a huge coat that looked almost like a blanket he was almost completely hidden under. Now, this was in a big screen, so it was a bit weird to find it so empty, but I didn't find it odd. The movie had been out for a decent while now, and most people who wanted to see it had likely already seen it. I didn't give it a second thought. We sat down in the middle of a row that was in the middle but near the front and chatted for a bit until the film finally started. It was about 10 minutes in when I first noticed something strange. You know when you feel like someone's watching you? It was that feeling. I turned back to look and saw that the man was no longer in the very back row, but 2 rows ahead. He was staring at the screen, but in a way that seemed like he was simply making a point of looking in that direction. His eyes never moved from the one exact spot they were staring at, never looking at another part of the screen where something else was happening. I don't know how long I was looking at him for, probably longer than is polite, but I saw the corner of his mouth lift in a smirk, with his eyes still fixed on the same position. I quickly turned back to face the screen and opened my snacks, trying to settle down and forget about it. I'm an anxious person, after all, and freaking out over nothing is my superpower. I tried to immerse myself in the movie and drown out the constant unease I was feeling. I'd felt like it before in the past, for no reason at all, and I told myself this was no different. I fought against the overwhelming urge to look behind me and see what he was doing. Eventually, though, I snapped back to reality out of my cocoon of denial by my friend nudging my arm. "Hey," she whispered, "look at the man behind us." The expression on her face didn't give off the sense of worry, but confusion. I took a deep breath and looked. The man was now 6 rows ahead from where he'd originally been, and he was clearly sitting on the floor, only his head down to the eyes visible as he peered over the seat in front of him to stare determinedly at the screen. I felt frozen in place, stuck staring at him when all I wanted was to turn my head back to see the screen and pretend everything was normal. As I stared, I saw his head turn, so slowly that it felt like minutes, until he was facing me. "Hello," he said in a voice that sounded so fake cheerful and polite that it wouldn't have been out of place at a call center. But the words, they didn't come out of his mouth correctly. His lips didn't move in the right way to create that word, and past his cheeks, his jaw had remained still. My friend had noticed. I could tell. She looked at me and seemed uncomfortable now. I wondered if she'd say hi back, ever the more social of the two of us, but she decided to ignore him and turn back to watch the movie. As I continued to stare at him, unable and unwilling to look away from, his mouth transformed into the most instantaneous smile I'd ever seen. His lips had been closed together, his mouth in a neutral position, and in a split second, the mouth was spread across his face in what would, in a normal circumstance, be a perfect smile. The only other off thing about it besides the speed of its arrival were the eyes. They were narrowed, and I thought I could make out a tear on one of the cheeks. It looked like he was in pain. I looked for 5 more seconds, his smile unchanging, but his eyes were producing more tears running down his cheeks. That was enough for me. "We need to go," I said to my friend as quietly as possible. She nodded and began to stand up. "Ha!" The sound came from the man behind us. It was a strange noise, half amused, half stern, like a command given in a language we didn't know. We both turned to look at him and found that he had silently moved to the seat in front of him, still covered with his coat wrapped around him. He was no longer smiling. I started to rise, my eyes not daring to leave his, but as I did, his mouth suddenly opened wide. Wider than humanly possible, open like when a snake dislocates its jaw to eat its prey. "Huh!" It sounded deeper this time. He was definitely angry at us. I saw him lean forward as he stared at us, and it looked like he was going to stand up too. I was struck by a thought, so I sat back down, pulling on Phoebe's arm, indicating her to sit down too, which she reluctantly did. Immediately, the gaping mouth snapped shut and was replaced with a small smile. And his eyes went back to the movie as though nothing had ever happened. Reluctantly, I turned back to face the screen again. "What do we do?" I asked Phoebe, completely out of my depth. "I don't know," she replied. She glanced back at him again quickly. "He doesn't seem to be doing anything anymore. Maybe we just wait for the film to finish and then leave?" My eyes widened in protest as she continued. "Well, one of the staff members comes in like 10 minutes before the film finishes, so we can just run out. Maybe with a witness there, he won't try anything." I looked at the screen, knowing just how much longer we had to go. Okay, but we're still a long way from that. Well, sometimes staff members come in for a bit, don't they? We'll keep an eye on the door. As soon as we see someone, we'll make a run for it. The nausea I felt being stuck in there with him was intense, but we had a plan, and it calmed my nerves slightly. Okay, one of us should keep an eye on the door. The others should... Phoebe's voice faltered, her eyes fixed at the bottom of the screen. He was there, at the front row. Neither of us had seen or heard him move from the seat behind us. His mouth stretched in a smile that held no happiness, only a threat. The tears were streaming down his face now, dripping from his cheeks, and his eyes were shut tightly. The coat that draped his body shook aggressively, but his head was still. I stared, as if in a trance, until Phoebe broke it with her defiance in the face of absolute terror. "Nope," she stated, the sound of determination and anger overruling her fear as she pulled out her phone. I was about to ask her what she was doing, but I saw her press the number 9 and realized she was calling the police. It was sudden. The man leapt, covering 3 rows in a single bound. The smile on his face didn't even falter. "Oh God," I breathed. The man was staring at me now. Phoebe pressed the second number on her phone, and yet again the man leaped, still smiling. Another 3 rows. At once we panicked. I stood up. Phoebe had dropped her phone and was hurriedly trying to pick it up, and as I yelled, "Hurry!" at her. And as all of this was happening, the man was vocalizing a constant stream of "ha, ha, ha, ha," as we moved or spoke, getting angrier and angrier, the mouth getting wider and wider until the jaw finally broke. It dangled uselessly as the man stared at us, still attempting to communicate his threats to us, until I sat back down and Phoebe put her phone down. Then the man became silent and simply stared at us. We were stuck, officially out of ideas. We couldn't stand up, and it was clear that making a run for it would be pointless considering how far the man could jump. And we couldn't call for help. Uneasy minutes passed by without incident, the man simply standing a few rows ahead of us, staring at us as the movie played. We entered into a very tense stalemate that lasted a long time. I don't know how long this carried on for, but eventually, of course, things got worse. The man leapt forward 1 row, the unhinged jaw swaying with every movement. The tears had long stopped, but the eyes still screamed in agony. I looked at Phoebe, attempting to get the words out, but finding myself speechless. She simply shook her head, feeling as hopeless as I did. The man leapt forward again. He was 3 rows in front of us. Just 3. He can leap 3 in a single bound, we knew. Then his shaking body moved, his shoulders shrugging the coat off of his body and onto the floor. The sound of gunfire and explosions drowned out my gasp. The arms were useless. Protruding from each forearm, breaking through the skin, were 2 long, thick limbs that ended in countless moving, pale tendrils of varying lengths. The legs were in the stomach area, bits of internal organs smeared down them. The rest of the torso was non-existent. It could no longer be called anything other than a mass of flesh that was home to hundreds of tendrils, maybe incessantly feeling around the rib cage that was exposed in some areas. A small hole was in the center, surrounded by a circle of lumps that ended in a slight point. And that was it. It didn't matter that he didn't like it when we attempted to leave. It didn't matter because there was no chance of us surviving if we did what he wanted and stayed still. I frantically grabbed Phoebe by the arm, dragging her despite the fact that she was already moving before I'd barely started. We made our way along the empty row of seats as fast as we could, but I think we barely made it along 5 seats before I saw him, out of the corner of my eye, making his effortless leap. I dropped to the floor and shut my eyes, awaiting the pain that was going to befall me. It didn't come. So I didn't hesitate. I stood back up, still holding tightly onto Phoebe's arm and running along the row again. I didn't notice at first, but then I did. As fast as Phoebe was running earlier, I could feel the slight weight behind my grip on her arm. But it had been severed. Just like her arm from the rest of her body. I realized as I turned behind me to look. The credits were rolling. And Phoebe's shrieks of torment reverberated across the entire room. The man's arm tendrils were restraining her even as she thrashed against her own demise, desperate to live. It was hopeless, though. The torso tendrils were reaching between the restraints of the arm tendrils, piercing through her stomach, digging around for a few moments before emerging again with pieces of her internal organs grasped by them. Then they blindly felt their way to the hole in the center and shoved my best friend's viscera inside. This was a constant process for several minutes, with Phoebe's cries growing weaker but still constant. Eventually, mercifully, the tendrils of the arms released their hold on Phoebe's body and reached for her neck, wrapping themselves around it. She tried feebly to pull them away with her one remaining arm, but it made no difference. She was so little a threat, and the man knew that the tendrils didn't even attempt to stop her. She continued trying to pull them off of her neck until the moment they snapped it. I feel relieved about that. I didn't at the time to overcome with horror, but I do now. The tendrils started digging into the neck, ripping away the flesh, and again feeding the starving maw until the head was entirely severed from the body. Then the mouth opened wide, wider still, until it nearly filled the width of the entire torso, and then descended upon Phoebe's disconnected head before shrinking again back into its previous size. Her head was devoured, and her body lay on the floor, excavated of her internal organs. And I stood there and watched all of it, terrified, horrified, yet mesmerized. I dare not move, and yet I knew I was next. I hadn't even realized that the trailers were playing on the screen as this had been going on, but I briefly noticed just in that moment that a new movie was about to start. Then, without warning, the man leapt continuously, not even sparing a glance at me, until he was seated once again, just like he had when Phoebe and I had first entered, but this time without his coat. I was still holding Phoebe's arm, I saw. I dropped it. I was ready to make a run for the exit, my only chance of surviving. But then I noticed him. A man who works here stood right in front of the exit door, staring right at me with an extremely polite smile on his face. I looked at him for a moment and then back to the man behind me, weighing out my choices, realizing there weren't any. I started to run. "Sit down," the staff member said, his smile even more fake. I slowed down but continued walking, noticing that the man behind me hadn't leapt forward or made a noise like he did the last time I tried to escape. "Sit down," the guy continued, the voice lower, the threat clear. "Sit down. Sit 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 down." I sat, and immediately he stopped. The film started playing. It's the new Jumanji film. The man who is not a man has moved forward 7 rows now. He's staring at me, no longer smiling because he can't, but I know. He's playing with me, toying with his food before eating it. He will slowly move closer to me until the movie ends, and then he'll kill me like he did Phoebe. I need help. It won't be long before the movie ends. Please, help me. If I don't make it out, please don't do what we did. Don't watch a movie with only one other person in the same room. Look out for the signs. Maybe they exist in other locations too. Just watch out for them. And please, help me.